Здравствуйте, товарищи. This is Ushanka Show speaking. I'm your host, Sergei Sputnikov, and we're going to talk about life in the Soviet Union. So I have a question from David from New Zealand. It's pretty cool. Upon the breakup of the Soviet Union, what happened to the people's houses when they were owned by the state? Did they get given to the occupiers, or kept by the government, or maybe sold to private businesses? Thanks in advance. By the way, if you are interested in the topic of Soviet housing, I'll recommend to check my playlist called Soviet Housing. Currently has 18 videos that covering all the aspects of living in the Soviet apartments, living in homes, like private homes, so you're welcome to check it out, Soviet Housing. So in today's videos, we're not going to talk about Soviet apartments. We're going to talk about actual houses, and there were two options. There were private homes, and there were homes that owned by, I won't say owned by the government, mostly it was owned by local, maybe collective farm or a factory or something like that. For example, my grandparents in northern Ukraine owned their two-room log cabin, but they didn't own the land that log cabin was sitting on. It was just permitted to use. So the plot of land that had the garden and land where the home was sitting on were not their property, just the log cabin. And they didn't have a property taxes because technically just the home was sitting on the state property. As you may be well aware, there was no private property in the Soviet Union, but we had some personal property. So for example, a home in the village or your summer home dacha was your personal property, but not your private property. So if a Soviet citizen had a home in personal property, usually out in the villages, they could sell it or purchase it, but of course people in the big cities, they couldn't buy or sell apartments because they didn't belong to them. Situation changed a bit in 1988. On December 2nd, 1988, Soviet Ministrov, so the Soviet of Ministers of the Soviet Union, came up with the law that allowed selling to the citizens into the personal property again, apartments on homes that used to belong to the government or belong to society, almost like a local community. Of course, there were quite a few limitations. The person could purchase an apartment or home only if you lived there, or apartment or home that was in bad shape, like abandoned and need to be restored. That was the only way you could purchase it. You couldn't buy somebody else's apartment. The pricing was up to owners. So if, for example, if some factory owned an apartment, that would be up to them to set up pricing. So of course it opened a can of worms with corruption and, buddy-buddy relations. And one family were allowed to own or purchase only one apartment or one home. And it didn't go really well because, for example, in the Russian Federation by 1990, only 0.09% of all housing was purchased that way, was privatized. So as you see, privatization of housing was available even before the collapse of the Soviet Union. But what's interesting, not many people were interested in doing it, and I kind of see it. If you have an option to buy an apartment, but you're renting it so cheap, why would you want to waste a lot of money, maybe the money you don't have, if you can just keep on renting it next to nothing, 10% of your income or even less. Now, the real mass privatization of housing began in Russian Federation in July of 1991 and in Ukraine only after it became independent in 1993. So that was the law about privatizing of the whole housing in the country free of charge. So that was pretty much transferring housing and, of course, responsibilities from the state to individual people. You could do it only once in your life, free of charge. You could do it voluntarily once forced, and only where you lived. So the place where you stayed at apartment or house, that's what you could privatize. So I said, in Russia, it began even before the dissolution of the Soviet Union. In Ukraine, 2 years later. So a massive wealth transfer occurred at that time from the state to private citizens. But of course, we can talk about massive if you live, for example, in Moscow or Kiev, capital of Ukraine, St. Petersburg, because housing there appreciated drastically, especially Moscow. I mean, people could become millionaires by privatizing their small apartment downtown Moscow back in 1991 and then selling for $1 million, 20 years later. Meanwhile, if a person privatized a home that was given to that person by a collective farm, for example, in our village, we had that program started in mid of 80s. Collective farms were so desperate for specialists, so they were building homes and letting like teachers or doctors or agriculture specialists live there free of charge. Then they could privatize it, but those homes never appreciated greatly. You can probably buy it for $1,000, $2,000 even before the beginning of the war. I had an opportunity to meet a person that utilized that 1988 law about transferring a home from the property that belonged to the factory, and the guy was a director of that factory, and it happened like in 1989, but he saved his savings that way. That was interesting. So it's another topic for the separate video, but I believe it's like right 1989 or 1990. The Soviet government is having problems with finances. They froze people's savings, like they didn't let us to touch our savings accounts. That's how my family lost 5,000 rubles. Well, this guy, he was, as I said, director of the factory that was making alcohol, and he was a big party leader too. So they got early notice, hey, money was going to be frozen. So he quickly took money off the savings account and he pushed through this privatization process and purchased that house. So instead of letting money disappear in a savings bank, he saved that money by putting them in the house. So for him, it made sense to do it. And that way, and of course, he was director of the factory that was the owner of that home. So that was pretty interesting. And that was a nice home. That's the only time I saw a home that was built like by American standards, stick built, or what they call them Canadian style. And it had central heat, had a hot water boiler, had running hot and cold water. But what was interesting, because it was so expensive to pump the sewer, and that sewer didn't have a drain field, so there's just a big tank that fills with water and everything else that you flush in the toilet. So they found that it's too expensive for them to pump it because they had to pump often, right, since the water didn't disappear. So they end up using their outhouse and not using the bathroom indoors. That was really bizarre. Although they had that option, they used outhouse. And I was so shocked about that. So I actually took a picture of their bathroom. So as you see, there is a bucket sitting under the sink. So you can use sink, but then you have to carry bucket outside and dump the water in the garden. And the bathtub completely covered with boards just for like storage. So you don't use bathtub at all. And you don't use toilet either. You go outside and use outhouse. And that home, because it was in a small town, well, not in the village, and it had a detached garage and all these conveniences, its current price probably, I don't know, $30,000, $40,000. Instead, it's a really nice house, built modern way, not the log cabin like my grandparents lived. And of course, after you privatized your apartment or home, then you could do whatever you want with it. You could sell it to a private business, or you can rent. Like a lot of people were making a lot of money by, if they had a nice location downtown Kyiv, for example, or Moscow, they would just rent their apartment to business. So there'll be actually like offices in a regular apartment building, but there'll be office of the small company. I actually worked in such company, and it was literally like second floor, a regular apartment building, but there'll be office of the oil, gas and diesel fuel retail company. You just, people on the phone all day buying and selling gasoline and diesel fuel. And I already have a video about my family housing story, how we purchased a 3-room so-called cooperative apartment back in 1981 or 82. I'll post the link below this video in the comment section if you missed that video somehow. So we were in that gray field because it didn't belong to the government, but technically it didn't belong to us either. It belonged to a cooperative. So we couldn't really sell it. But my mom also got it privatized when it was allowed. But we had to purchase it and pay 15,000 rubles. but it's now worth probably, I don't know, $25,000, $30,000. What baffles me that by 2015 in Russian Federation, only 79% of housing was privatized. So the government offered people to take over their apartments or houses free of charge, and still only 80% took advantage of it in 24 years since 1991. So that's kind of interesting. Well, that's all I have for you today. Thanks for watching Ushanka Show. As always, please don't forget to like this video, maybe post a comment. It supposedly helps in YouTube algorithm. And we'll talk to you soon. До свидания. Goodbye.
Sergey wrote a book based on diaries he made when he was first in the United States. And as I understand, this is just volume 1, right? That's correct. He's going to have multiple volumes coming out. Well, I said, well, since Sergey is kind enough to come up and speak with us, I bought the book. I said, I might as well read this. I read this in one sitting, 2 hours, 2.5 hours. I just couldn't put it down. It was so fascinating because your writing is very compelling, for one, and his story is very interesting, for two. It's really interesting. You know, we've lived here our whole lives. We don't have that perspective. It's just so interesting to hear someone else's perspective about what we take for granted. So I hope you really tune in and listen to what he has to say. It's a very interesting, very informed perspective. Sergey is not a historian. He's an electrical engineer by trade, but I find that he has a depth of understanding on history, economics, culture. So just a very observant fellow and a great storyteller. So